Hey, everybody, I'm Jamie Poisson. This week, thousands of pages of documents from sex offender Jeffrey Epstein's estate were released. First, email exchanges where Epstein suggests that Donald Trump knew more about Epstein's crimes than the president has let on, though the White House has called it a smear job. Then, an additional 23,000 pages that tell a story that goes much further than the White House. They give some more insight into just how enmeshed Epstein was with global power players and events. We're going to discuss all of this today with Murtaza Hussain. Murtaza reports on national security and foreign affairs for Dropsite News. His reporting also details an increasingly complex picture of the link between Epstein and Israeli intelligence officials. Okay, let's get to it. Murtaza, hi. Thank you so much for coming on to Front Burner.
Thanks for having me.
So let's talk first about what House Democrats released. These are 3 exchanges over email between the years 2011 and 2019. They include conversations about President Trump. And why don't we begin with the one between Epstein and his confidant, Ghislaine Maxwell, in 2011. Epstein writes, quote, "I want you to realize that the dog that hasn't barked is Trump." He adds that
Virginia spent hours at my house with him. A reference to Virginia Giuffre, the White House says, one of Epstein's victims who died by suicide earlier this year, though she never accused Trump of wrongdoing.
He has never once been mentioned. To which Maxwell responds with, quote, "I have been thinking about that." And what do you make of that back and forth?
Yeah, it's interesting seeing these communications because obviously, to some degree, they're fragmentary and they're open to interpretation.
hmm
But a lot of these emails, when we have the full context of what we know Epstein was doing at that time and the relationship between them, it's very suggestive of what Trump may have known and what his own dealings with Epstein may have entailed. So, while it's hard to say determinably, it does strongly suggest that there was some shared knowledge of Epstein's activities. And if you look at the other communications, there's like a intimacy that clearly existed personally between them, which suggests that it would have been difficult for Trump to not have been aware.
hmm hmm I just want to go over a couple more exchanges. There's the series of emails between Epstein and the American journalist and author Michael Wolff about Trump. And months before Epstein was eventually arrested, Epstein says to Wolff about Trump, of course he knew about the girls as he asked Ghislaine to stop. Democrats are using this to suggest that Trump may have intervened in some way or was at the very least aware of the fact that there were underage victims. And then there's another exchange between Epstein and Wolff in 2015. Just before a scheduled presidential debate, Wolff tells Epstein that CNN plans to ask Trump about the nature of their relationship during the debate. Epstein responds with, quote, "If we were able to craft an answer for him, what do you think it should be?" And Wolff says, quote, "Let him hang himself. If he says he hasn't been on the plane or to the house, that gives you currency." There's a lot that jumps out at me about this one. Questions about Wolff and Epstein and how this question would have even made it to Wolff before a debate. But also, as you were saying, this level of coordination that Epstein himself was involved in concerning the question of his and Trump's relationship. And just like, how about you? How are you thinking about that one?
Yeah, I totally agree with what you're saying regarding the interesting sort of communication between Epstein and ostensibly a journalist, where it seems like they're more engaging in strategizing. And I think what's very fascinating about this email is that there's been speculation for a very long time that perhaps Epstein was involved in blackmailing people because he had the knowledge of people's transgressions and illegal activities related to the sexual abuse of minors. He had this island, he had these apartments, he had these connections where he was said to be facilitating the sex trafficking. So, would someone in a position like that be able to use it to compromise people? And this exchange with Wolf, it doesn't prove that, but it's another data point which is suggestive of the fact that they had considered things like this at least.
hmm I know that journalists are still sorting through what's in the rest of these documents that the Republicans dropped, but some of it that has come out so far is pretty wild. There's an email that shows a former New York Times reporter tipped off Epstein that another journalist was looking into him. Messages where Epstein positions himself as an advisor to foreign officials, like suggesting that he could give the Russian foreign minister insight into dealing with Trump, mentioning he'd had similar conversations with Russia's ambassador to the United Nations and talking politics with people like Steve Bannon, promising him these one-on-ones with government leaders in 2018 when he was still advising Trump. I know that there's a lot there, but when you look at kind of this information that's coming out, does it give us a clearer picture of just how deep Epstein ties actually went? Just how kind of enmeshed he was in all of this globally.
So, I think there's two important points about this. First of all, the emails, just what we see right now, they do look really bad. They have a lot of damning information, seemingly about a lot of people. Epstein, very fascinatingly, what I found is that he seemed to have far more connections around the world with powerful people than I think one person would be able to organically generate. There seemed to be something almost inorganic about the level of access he had to political officials at all levels in very geographically disparate parts of the world, uh, powerful business magnates all around the world, and so forth. It seems difficult to be able to generate that on one's own. That's just my interpretation. And secondly, you know, I do find something interesting about these disclosures, which is that in a way, what they're disclosing is very important, but on the other hand, they seem to sort of elide broader questions. So it points a lot to Epstein's involvement in sex trafficking, and that's a really horrifying and important story that should be known and should be focused on. But there's another aspect to Epstein, which is his ties to foreign governments and intelligence agencies, how he developed those ties, what he used those ties for, what his interests were, on whose behalf he worked, what were the consequences of those interactions. That aspect of the story has not really been focused on a lot. And it's not to say that the sex trafficking part is a distraction, because that's also an extremely important part on its own. I think the two have to be understood in conjunction with one another. But without the other aspect of the story, which I think we have insufficient transparency about, insufficient focus on, I don't think that the whole picture of who Epstein was and what he was doing, it really becomes clear. And I would just close by analogizing it to the metaphor of, a bunch of blind people touching an elephant. They're all touching a different part of the elephant, but they can't really understand the full elephant until, that picture is clear. And I think that's the issue with Epstein now. We're all having fragmentary parts of the story, and that's not true transparency. And in some ways, it can also be a distraction.
Well, when you say that you think it's kind of inorganic, right? That was the word that you used, that he would have that level of access, that you do not think that he could do it on his own to all of these world leaders and powerful people. Like, what do you mean by that? Do you mean that you think that the emails are exaggerated or not true? Or are you talking about something else here?
Yeah, no, what I mean is that, if you look at these emails as well as separate batches of emails that have been released through other channels, showing this range and scope of Epstein's access, it's interesting because he is technically a private citizen, but political officials at the highest level all over the world are seeking his access and support. Government officials, again, all over the world are seeking his access and support. And yet he has no position that would seem to justify this level of influence. He's not a government official. He's not a powerful business magnate per se. He was someone who was, a math teacher who worked in finance for a little small time in Wall Street. And, he just seemed to be this gentleman who everyone seemed to nonetheless want to gain the support of. And if you look at his interactions with people as well, too, very powerful people we've reported on, heads of state, billionaires, oligarchs, they were all seeking his approval. They were seeking his attention and so forth. So, something doesn't add up in the description of who he was or who we're told to understand who he was and the influence and access that he enjoyed. There's a disconnect there, which is an important part of the story we have not yet gotten.
I think this is maybe a good place for us to get into some of your reporting on the links between Jeffrey Epstein, Israeli intelligence services, and the state of Israel more broadly. And it does bring some new light to this part of the Epstein story, particularly his relationship to a senior Israeli intelligence officer and longtime aide to the former Israeli PM and defense minister Ehud Barak. And can you walk me through some of what you have discovered?
So a few years ago, there was a hack that took place of a number of Israeli political officials and military officials. Among them was Ehud Barak, the former defense minister and Israeli prime minister. And those emails, it seems that the hack likely took place in 2016. That's roughly around the time the emails cut off. But they were done by what was described as the pro-Palestinian hacking group. We don't know the full identity of them, but they're speculated to maybe have ties to Iran and dumped online. And then they were later hosted by a file sharing website called Distributed Denial of Secrets. It's like a successor organization of WikiLeaks in a way. And the emails are currently on that website, sitting there alongside many other disclosures from different parts of the world. And the emails in Barak's inbox, they show extensive contacts with Epstein between the period of 2012, 2016, roughly.
Mhm.
And they show that Epstein and Barak had been very closely involved in helping Barak promote Israeli security interests and economic interests in different parts of the world. And Epstein was somebody who had extensive contacts in Africa, in Central Asia, in Europe, in Russia, in the United States. And he was making connections for Barak to help him promote technology firms to these foreign countries as a means of accomplishing numerous things. First of all, generating revenue for Barak as a private consultant, now leaving public life, but also furthering the interests of these firms and also finally the political interests of the Israeli government. What would happen is that Epstein would introduce Barak to people around the world in Mongolia, Cote d'Ivoire. These are a couple of countries we've written about already. We have more stories coming about this. Barak would sign deals with these countries with Epstein's coaching and guidance. And then later, those private deals would become the seed for formal security arrangements signed by the Israeli government and these foreign governments, which furthered the country's political interests. But the core of it all was Epstein.
Mhm.
And I think that it's really important to understand the current government disclosures, which again, I think are a bit fragmentary and don't necessarily make sense on their own, in conjunction with these emails. Because the emails show structurally what they were trying to accomplish and who Epstein was as a critical node for Barack and others, as an international deal maker, so to speak.
Mhm.
He had the money, he had the connections, and those emails really help to make sense of the government disclosures which are taking place right now. On their own, they don't always explain the whole story. I think we have to look at what's out there from other channels that they didn't control in conjunction with that, and then we can get a fuller picture.
Mhm. It's really interesting. I mean, there is this mythology, right, around Epstein as some kind of quasi agent working on behalf of a foreign government that's been around since the beginning of this story, that he was not just a sexual predator with elite connections, but this go between in intelligence. And let me ask you plainly, do you think that Jeffrey Epstein was an asset of some kind, whether formally or informally, of the Israeli intelligence service or of some other intelligence service?
Well, this is a question which has been asked for a long time, and even before current reporting was did Jeffrey Epstein work for the Mossad? I think the answer is no. He did not work for Israeli intelligence, but he did work with Israeli intelligence and the intelligence agencies of other countries as well too. I think that, it's difficult to sort of define, but he seemed like somebody who was above working for an intelligence agency. He was someone whom intelligence agencies relied upon for his influence and power. He furthered the interests of certain states, including the Israeli state, and he was ideologically invested in that too, as per his private communications. But he was certainly not someone who was answerable to the Israeli government per se, or employed by the Israeli intelligence, as far as any information that we have suggests. But that said, it was almost, if I were to put it in a kind of crude way, it kind of seemed like, in practical effect, the Mossad worked for Jeffrey Epstein rather than vice versa, because these Israeli intelligence-linked firms that he was helping Barak to deploy around the world, were clearly lower than him on the hierarchy of these interactions. And even Barack, who was one of the most influential people in the Israeli security establishment at that time, if you look at their communications, he was trying to get the attention of Epstein, support Epstein, rather than vice versa.
This narrative, that he is some kind of big intelligence player has been widely referred to as a conspiracy theory. And this new reporting of yours has not been picked up by mainstream American press really at all. And like, why do you think that is?
Well, this is an ongoing issue that I think myself and my colleagues have encountered. We've done a lot of reporting around the world, which has been verified by high-level government officials, and it's caused a lot of controversy in some cases. But oftentimes, because it's politically inconvenient, it's not always acknowledged. Or if a certain narrative is already anchored that something is a conspiracy or it's beyond the realm of possibility to discuss, there's a investment, I guess, in not acknowledging it when the contravening information comes to light. And presently, I think that the issue with the Epstein story is that it's being pigeonholed as part of the ongoing domestic political disputes in the United States between President Donald Trump and his opponents. And, Donald Trump's involvement in this is very important. But it seems that there's just not an incentive to discuss, this issue of his intelligence ties. If I were to speculate, I would suggest there's a few reasons for this. One is that a very broad range of powerful individuals are implicated in ties with Epstein. I'll put it this way: when we do reporting, the same names seem to be coming up a lot, and not just about Epstein, but other subjects as well too. We're working on a story right now about Epstein's ties to a certain African country. The names that come up in that story also were very prominent in another story myself and my colleagues did about the corruption in Pakistan a few months ago. But it's a small kind of relatively small community of people who are connected around the world who were implicated in this corruption, for whom the story is very injurious and raises uncomfortable questions. And there's a small Venn diagram of people who have the capacity and the willingness to report on this.
Hmm.
But there's a lot of people who it would just be very difficult to report on. It's not very hard. It's a technically challenging task to report these emails. And if someone does have the resources, they may not have the political willingness. So I think that's kind of what adds up to that. And yeah, I think that we shouldn't make assertions and believe things that lack evidence. But I do think that we do have evidence for something. We need to update our beliefs. So I hope that there is, for this reporting, a greater incentive by the quote unquote mainstream media to look into the subject more.
I mean, I guess depending on which direction this all heads in the US, you could get additional kind of records and information out of this too, right? To kind of not just focus on the Trump stuff, but all this broader stuff that you're talking about too, right? And just can you explain to me what's actually happening in the United States right now around like whether or not more records are going to be released? It centers around this thing called a discharge position, I think, it's like a rare parliamentary mechanism.
Yeah, so there's an effort in U.S. Congress to try to force more disclosures about Epstein.
Congresswoman Adelita Grijalva sworn in after a 7-week delay, signing on to the petition to force a vote on the file's release as her first act in Congress.
I will sign the discharge petition right now to release the Epstein files.
And it comes under the broader heading of the Epstein files. I do think that there's something about these disclosures which there's so much political interest in gaining short-term political advantage out of whatever they contain that I'm not totally certain whether it's actually aimed at furthering public transparency about the subject, period.
In an attempt to stop the petition, top White House and Justice Department officials, including the Attorney General and FBI Director, attempting to pressure Congresswoman Lauren Boebert into removing her name from it, meeting with her Wednesday in the Situation Room. But it didn't work. Boebert, ultimately one of 4 Republicans who signed on in support.
There's a term of art called the limited hangout that I think was coined by Richard Nixon. And it refers to a very damaging political subject which public is demanding information about, and public officials feel pressured to respond to, but they do not want to give the whole story, but they will give a part of the story in the hope that that will satiate public attention, while leaving the crux of the matter still private. So, I will wait for these disclosures. I do hope that any disclosure we get does help because it's more puzzle pieces we can use to put together a broader picture. But I don't bank everything on this disclosure happening. And then when it does happen, I will still be skeptical as to what have not been received. With the passage of time and the diminishment of the urgent political salience of issues, we do tend to learn more about historical episodes. Jeffrey Epstein died maybe 5, 6 years ago. It wasn't really that long ago. And as we discussed, the political issues he raised are still relevant to contemporary politics. And that disincentivizes people from being honest and transparent about this at the moment.
And just one last one before you go. I'd be curious to know what you make of this push that we've been seeing around Ghislaine Maxwell. Um, it was just revealed that she is working on her commutation application. Trump has repeatedly refused to rule out the fact that he could negotiate a deal with Maxwell that could see her released early from federal prison. But you see people in the MAGAverse, influencers, for example, starting to call themselves free Ghislaine advocates. They kind of see her as the Rosetta Stone. They feel like she is this well of information that should be tapped. And I how are you thinking about how do you think about that? Or do you see it kind of in the same way as you do these documents that are being released?
Well, anyone speaking more or giving us some information is helpful. And, she obviously is somebody who is integral to the sex trafficking that Epstein was involved in. I just find the whole issue with her commutation and the discussion of it to be so glaring in what seems to be just rank corruption at this point. I think that it's unfortunate that the MAGA movement has been crystallized as almost a cult of personality in some ways around Trump, furthering whatever his short-term political interests are. I think it's a degradation of what people hope to see out of any anti-establishment political candidate. And I assume that this commutation will come alongside significant concessions made by Maxwell to Trump, perhaps regarding these historical ties to between Trump and Epstein. So, I view it all as sort of a very complicated uh, political chess game which is going on. And I think that once the disclosures happen, more of them, and once maybe if Maxwell is commuted and what you see after, we can try to put together what they discuss thereafter. But I don't have any short-term hope that this will result in any greater transparency.
Okay. Murtaza, this was really, really interesting. Thank you so much for coming by.
Thank you so much for paying attention and for helping bring more public insight to the subject.
All right, that is all for today. Front Burner was produced this week by Joytha Shen-Gupta, Matt Muse, Matthew Amha, Lauren Donnelly, and Mackenzie Cameron. Our YouTube producer is John Lee. Our music is by Joseph Shabison. Our senior producer is Elaine Chow. Our executive producer is Nick McKay-Blokos, and I'm Jamie Poisson. Thanks so much for listening. We'll talk to you on Monday.